There we go. And so now I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Okay, so hopefully you can all see the first slide. Yeah. Before I get going, I do want to say that Megan kind of said it, but just to be clear, I'm going to go through a little bit of what this grant is to begin with. And Megan is, as she said, our partner at DEQ, and Megan manages the DEQ 319 Clean Water Act Fund, which is where this funding originally comes from. So Megan may have some additional insights. And Jess, who's the host site supervisor for the Gallatin River Task Force, she was once a member, just like you all, and she had this funding as well as project funding through us. And she's now has worked with, gosh, just three. How many members now have you supervised working on this same grant also? And so, yeah, so Jess will also be chiming in. Jess and Megan, just feel free to chime in. Like I said, it's been a bit of a wild day here, and so I might forget things. And so feel free to chime in, and then I'll ask Jess to speak a little bit at the end too. So yes, the Big Sky Watershed Corps grant reporting, and I put this on the slide. We're in this together because it's a lot. I feel like that. Has anybody here reported on or managed or applied for a grant before? The Big Sky members? Okay. And that's usually how it is. I don't know if we've ever had a member who's been like, yes, I've managed a grant. We've got somebody else coming in, maybe Anthony from the Yaak Valley Forest Council. So yeah, so the purpose of this is really there's a lot of information here, but your first report is not due till May. You'll be tracking things, you'll be moving around. Just, you can call me at any time. I'll have my contact information on the slide. You already have it in your emails. So really, truly, this is like a situation where you can reach out anytime. Always reach out to your host site supervisor first, because they're generally, well, with the exception of Courtney, they're usually the one who wrote this grant, and they'll know more about it, those specifics. But I'm always here for any specific reporting questions, anything as you go along. Let's see. So just an overview, we've done our introductions now. Going to talk about this grant and how you all got roped into reporting on it and carrying it out. Do an overview of the reporting, which is kind of the meat of things and what you really need to know. Then we will talk about match funding, which you may not even know what that is, but we'll talk about it, and how to track things. That's just the biggest takeaway from this, is just in whatever way you can. In general, your host site supervisors will have like a decent way that they already track things. We've got kind of a rudimentary spreadsheet that I sent you, but just be tracking everything from the start, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. And also, if you have questions, just kind of specific things, feel free to ask things as we go along. We're a small enough group. You can just unmute or raise your hand if you want to. So, as I alluded to earlier when I was talking about Megan's role in this funding comes from Section 319 of the Federal Clean Water Act, passed back in the 70s by the EPA. And that's why you'll sometimes hear us refer to it as 319 funding. The Montana Department of Environmental Quality administers it on behalf of EPA. And then they give us a grant, MWCC a grant, and we then subgrant out to all of you. And so you'll see in your reporting, we ask you if you do any big publicity flyers, or if you're creating an educational sign, or anything like that, to just acknowledge all three of those funders, and that's in your funding agreement. And so to reiterate, MWCC, the organization I work for, we are a nonprofit, statewide conservation nonprofit, but these are federal funds because they originally come from the EPA. Does that make sense? Missing anything? Okay. So the purpose of this grant, I won't read this entire thing here, but it's really, it's really giving watershed groups, conservation districts, those local watershed conservation organizations in Montana, the capability to carry out these watershed restoration plans, which I'll get into in a minute, and to reduce non-point source pollution in their watersheds. Basically water quality, but specifically those not, so point source is, a factory is dumping so much effluent, or a municipality, a city is, treating their sewage and then putting that runoff into the water at a specific point source, and non-point source is just, it's coming from anywhere. People fertilizing their lawns, agricultural use, erosion, if there's not enough vegetation on the stream banks that could cause sedimentation. So all those things are non-point source pollution. And watershed, this term WRP, stands for Watershed Restoration Plan. I'm curious, well, first show of hands, I forgot to ask, how many of you Big Sky members have seen the funding agreement, also known as the MOU, for this grant? Has anybody not? Okay. Okay, great. So you've at least seen it in submittable, or your supervisor gave it to you. So a lot of this is in there too, that whole watershed restoration plan. So if you don't know already, you will get to know your local watershed restoration plan a little bit because you are helping to carry that out. And it's also to increase the capacity of these local groups to achieve these long-term conservation goals that are related to improving water quality. And then for you, really all this funding, you'll see we have additional MWCC, the Watershed Fund, has additional funding for professional development, which you've hopefully already seen that you can apply to attend events and conferences related to non-point source pollution. And there's also upcoming funding that will allow you to apply for if you want to carry out a restoration project with your host site. And all of that stuff is, yeah, in part aimed at supporting the Big Sky Watershed Corps program and giving you guys opportunities to learn and grow in your careers too. Okay, so reporting. So yes, you found your host site's MOU. That's great. Just to reiterate, these are your reporting dates. It's all in there. And that scope of work, if you scroll down to the very bottom of your MOU, there's going to be a scope of work, and that is exactly what you're going to be reporting on. Yeah, and if you ever need to find that in submittable, I'm gonna, oh, I forgot to log in before we got to this. So I'm gonna real quick just show you where you can find this in submittal. And actually, I'm gonna stop sharing for 1 second. Does anybody have any questions so far on yeah, any of that stuff? Okay.
No.
Thanks. I'm really just killing time while I log in because I forgot to do that. And I just wanted to thank Jess. Oh, Maya joined us. Yeah, I just wanted to thank Jess and the Gallatin River Task Force for sharing their submittable account with me. So I'm going to reshare now. So hopefully you've all logged in. This is, anyway, I'll get to their actual. So if you see a page like this or something, you just go to your user account, My Submissions. And your organization may be the same. You may have a whole lot of grants in here besides this, but you just want to find 2024 Big Sky Watershed Corps host site, cost share, and that's as much as you'll see there. And then click on that. All the activity is in here, anything that I've sent to you or you've sent back. Messages is where you're going to find those Word documents of the reporting form, again, in that email I sent you. And then forms, this is where you're going to find your reporting form. Hopefully you've already seen this, but if not, now you know what it looks like. And you'll see there's a final reporting form and an interim reporting form. And I'll just open up the interim just to show you that. And it's got some instructions at the bottom. And I have to say, like, I feel like the instructions are really extensive on these. There's a lot of, because I'm trying to just be, but sometimes it's a lot. So, you know, just take it piece by piece when you go in here. But it's helpful to look at this before you really dive into your work because you know what you're going to be reporting on. Notes on match funding, which I'll get into. And then in this section on the interim, it just tells you what to expect in your final reporting form. You can also just look at the final reporting form. But the interim especially is really straightforward. You just, you know, giving us your name and email. And then you have these tasks, right? So every task in your scope of work, which I'll get into, has like a corresponding question. And some of you, I don't think any of you have just one task, but some of you might only have 2 or 3. I don't know if anybody has 5, but there's room for up to 5 tasks if you have them. So I'm going to go back now to share MOU. Shoot, actually, no, I'm going to do it from here. We go back. So here's that MOU. So again, it's got all your reporting deadlines in here. It also has this underlined part again that I was talking about with the logos that I sent you all yesterday, acknowledging MWCC, DEQ, and EPA wherever you can. And then at the bottom is your scope of work. So when you go to fill in this report, you're literally going to cut and paste. Like we've tried to make this like really, really easy. And I'm going to show you an example in just a minute too. But okay, for example, in the Gallatin River Task Forces in, oh my gosh, I'm trying to get everybody coordinated with who they work for. That's Lauren. Lauren works for the Gallatin River Task Force. So you're literally going to go in here and cut, like just did it as sort of like 1A, 1B, 1C. So you cut and paste out of here. Go, oops, that's the wrong submittable screen. Go back to your forms. Oh, and I forgot the title. So you're also going to go back. And you're going to title, yeah. So the title, volunteer management and recruitment. A lot of you all are working on stuff like that. Cut and paste into your form. Cut and paste the task description. So this will include 1A run out. So literally you can put exactly as it is. And then bullets are always great. Some sort of, or just gaps between, oh, I thought this let you do bullets, but maybe it doesn't. Anyway, or just, you know, space between things. So it's easy to read. And then, okay, run off, clean off. So let's pretend that Lauren has already done this and she would just write. And then like a sentence or two about what she did. And then there's one, she like, this is August or September. So for her first report, she won't have done anything. So she'll just type in not, oops, done. You don't even have to tell me when you're going to start it because it's already in here. And you just go through that. There's again instructions in here, but it's basically telling you what I've just told you in here. Also, sometimes it happens where there's some restoration projects, you know, this probably wouldn't, that's a pretty big part of it. But, you know, maybe let's say the runoff cleanoff gets canceled for some reason. You know, you would just write, this got canceled and here's why, or it got postponed or whatever. And I'm doing something else instead. That's totally fine. If there are big changes, like I would say, you know, that something like if 2 of these things dropped off, I would start to be concerned you weren't going to finish the whole task itself. But small changes are not a big deal. Just tell us why they happened. If there's something big that you were expecting to happen that's not going to happen, maybe give me a call ahead of time, but you should be talking to your host site supervisor about it too. And then I'll just get through this one. Same thing with deliverables. Deliverables are, so I feel like, does anybody have questions so far? I feel like I'm going through this. It always feels really fast. Okay.
I have a quick question. Mm-hmm. If something is like that we're working on is not listed in the MOU, do we not have to report on it?
Good question. Really good question. So you all are probably doing things that have nothing to do with this grant, right? This grant is not, for some of you, it's almost everything you're doing. But some of you may be doing things that have nothing to do with water quality or non-point source pollution. Those things you definitely don't want to report. But if there's something, and And I guess the bottom line is, if you're doing something that's not in here, you don't have to report on it. But especially if there's something really related, you're like, oh, well, I did this extra thing that is related. Like I managed and recruited volunteers for a different event, or I did education and outreach for a different thing. Yeah, we want to know about that, especially if you end up, if something in here gets dropped, like you don't, sometimes it happens that one event doesn't happen and you do something else instead. We definitely want to know that. So basically, if it's related to any of these tabs, like restoration implementation, yes. But if it's something that's totally outside of these tasks, then no. Does that make sense? Okay. And that's a good reminder to me that I didn't really explain, because again, if you've never managed a grant before, in general, your scope of work, this title, like this is, we just call this the task. This is like the overarching thing that you're going to get done. And I did share with you guys like a list of definitions, grant definitions, so it'll explain that there. And then to get this bigger task done, right? You want to volunteer, you're trying to manage and recruit more volunteers for the task force. This is how you're going to do it, right? These activities are the individual things you're going to do to recruit more and manage volunteers. And then, so they're like the subtasks, essentially. And then based on these subtasks, oh, and also this is like approximately how much of your time. Don't worry about this too much. This is just the WRP reference. This is your watershed restoration plan. You might want to just take a look at section 7, page 18 to see what it actually says and how your work fits in with it. But yeah, these activities are what are helping you get the task done, and the task is carrying out this local watershed restoration plan that your watershed group or conservation district is helping to do to improve water quality. And then deliverables are, I always describe them as like tangible things that come out of your activities. So a lot of times they're numbers, but it might also be a report or a flyer. They're not things like had a meeting with so-and-so or went out to look at the restoration site. That's more of, that's almost like a little activity within an activity, but those are things you do, like kind of verbs, right? Deliverables tend to be like a concrete noun or a number. So you'll see examples in here. The Lauren's goals for this task of managing and recruiting volunteers are to recruit 15 new volunteers, host 4 events, and engage 200 total volunteers. And that could be, right, a bunch of people who volunteered for them before. Tangible things. And I'll just, while I'm on that. Yeah, and then here's an example for task 2 deliverables, 2 events hosted. But 1 blog art, that's more of like a tangible thing that you might actually end up sharing with us. These numbered events, like you just tell me, okay, we actually engaged only 65 people. It's fine. There's no penalty. There's no, if you only engage 20 people, you might want to say, oh, well, it poured rain, and, just give me a brief explanation of why, why that number is lower. But there's no penalty. We're not taking your money away if you don't reach all your deliverables, but you should be meeting most of them. Hopefully your host site supervisors made a decent estimate of what they think you'll accomplish. And then for things, I'm trying to see if there's an example of this in here. Yeah, all of these things, these numbers, like they're just things you're gonna, again, copy and paste into the right section in your report down here. And same thing, you'll just write complete or in progress or not started yet or not, or I've got all this wording in here, deliverable will not completed, just to let me know where you're at on that. Same thing if you're off by a little bit, it's not a big deal. If you're going to be off by a lot or a big thing isn't happening, talk to your site supervisor and then reach out to me. Questions so far on that reporting? Okay. And then we get into the match funding sources, which is not, I'm not going to get into it as much in this moment, but match funding, and there's information on this in that FAQ document I sent, that's probably the best source to look at for knowing what match funding is. But essentially this grant, because it's federal funding, the federal government, the EPA, wants to know that you have other partners, other funding sources supporting this project too. that they're not the only ones contributing, that there's like local support for this project. So your match cannot come from federal sources. You might have someone from the US Fish and Wildlife Service or someone from the Forest Service helping you out on a project. That is totally fine. They can help you with anything, but you can't count their time as match. You can, anyway, I'm gonna hold that thought for just a minute. But basically your match funding sources are the exact same thing, where you will go into your MOU, see what, and this one is a little trickier because it may very well be different. This is not going to be as much of a cut and paste because this is really an estimate, but you'll work with your host site supervisor to figure out, yeah, how much staff time did they actually spend helping you on this project, and all that stuff. And but that'll be a little bit less of a cut and paste. But it feels like we're at the point where I need to be talking about, oh, hang on. Yeah. What is match? Okay. So hopefully I kind of said that earlier. And yeah, Megan, I know Megan, Jess, feel free to jump in anytime. Just trying to drag this bar a little bit. All right. So funding you'll use to carry out your tasks in addition to funds from the grant you're managing and reporting on. Like I said, because EPA wants to know you have other support for this. Most funders want to know that you're not the only one, that they're not the only one supporting your project and that others are contributing too. That scope of work I just send you, that should be your guide. Your host site supervisor was like, okay, this is where we think we'll have funding from. However, we wrote those scopes of work back in September, October, and so things may have changed. So just check in to see what your match might actually be. And then for each of your grants, so if your grant is $7,000, you need $7,000 in match, in like additional funding. And all of that funding has to help you with your specific projects. So you'll report your match under each, or sorry, your tasks. You'll report your match under each of those individual tasks. Some tasks you might have no match for at all. You might just say, I did this thing. There wasn't really, it's kind of rare actually, but maybe no one was helping you on it. Maybe it was a pretty straightforward something and you don't have any match at all. That's fine. As long as your other tasks add up to the total amount of your grant. And again, all from non-federal sources. Does that make sense? Do you guys, or does that not make sense? What match is or isn't? Okay. This slide is just to reiterate again, there is no federal match. You can have these contributions from any federal agency. You can use those, that's fine, but you can't report on them because these match sources have to be non-federal. And just a note, I've crossed these out because these are all grants that Big Sky Watershed Corps members tend to apply. Well, the 319 project grants, your host site supervisor might have one of those. It's the exact same pot of funding. Basically, if you have any of these grants or you end up applying for or receiving any of these grants, they can't count as match because in spite of their titles, in spite of the fact that they don't say some of them don't say 319, they don't say federal, they don't say EPA, anything. They look like they come from the Montana Association of Conservation Districts and us, the Montana Watershed Coordination Council, but they're originally federal funds. So that's all in your FAQ document. You probably won't remember this, but non-federal match, grants, donations, other contributions from any of these organizations, anybody who's not a federal agency. The beauty of collaborative conservation in Montana is that you're going to be working with a lot of partners. I know for a fact some of you will be working with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. You'll probably be working with other nonprofits, maybe your local conservation district, all kinds of partners. So they could have contributions that you can count on this. And match can be either cash or in kind. Cash means you have another grant or your organization is using private donations to get some of your work done. That is all great, but most of your match is going to come from in-kind donations. And that means somebody working with you, and you can ask them, or I think this is on my next slide. Actually, maybe. Okay, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. So cash match, like I said, donations, fundraising, anything not federal that's cash match. In kind, the way to think about it is donations of things you would normally have to pay for. So normally you would have to pay someone to come out and help you set up your table at the farmer's market, or do water quality monitoring with you, or plant trees with you, or any of those things. You would have to pay somebody to help you do that. If someone's volunteering for that, whether that's a student or a community member or somebody from your local conservation district or somebody from the local watershed group, other Big Sky Watershed Corps members will probably help you with some of your work. That is all considered an in-kind donation. Those people are contributing their time. They're not giving you money, but they're giving you their time for something you would otherwise have to pay for. Does that make sense or not make sense? And then also, so that time is going to be the biggest one. That's honestly where you're going to get, and I know Jess mentioned this to me, that just adding up the staff time, like if you think about all the time that your host site supervisor, I mean, start tracking it now, be like, I talked to Courtney for an hour today about my work on non-point source pollution, about my work on these things. That's whatever Courtney's billing rate is, which most of our billing, it's not what we get paid, but most of our billing rates are, upwards of $30 an hour. So right there, that's $30 of in-kind match. If you had 10 volunteers come out and help you plant trees for 3 hours, that's 30 hours. And I'll get to this in a minute, but there's kind of a standard, it's going to be, again, about $30 to $30-ish an hour. So it really adds up fast if you track it. So you just want to have some kind of spreadsheet, just track everything from the start. And you will just be shocked at how fast it adds up, especially, again, your coworkers at the organizations you work for. If you just think about the time they're spending, that's all match for this grant, because we are not paying. This grant pays part of your host site's payment to MCC for hosting you. It's not paying for any of your staff time. It's not paying for anything else. So that's all match. Other things, any kind of materials, right? If somebody, again, it would have to be a state agency, but like if MCC, I know MCC will sometimes loan out tools for projects. That's how much would it cost you to rent those things? And you're estimating, it's all an estimate, but just something that seems reasonable. Mileage, right? If you're driving somewhere and your host site organization is paying you for that, which they should be. If they're not, they should be. But your mileage, right? Your mileage is not covered by this. That is matched too. Also mileage of your volunteers. If a local business donates food for one of your events, that's in-kind match. Anything that anyone is giving you doesn't come from the federal government that you would otherwise have to pay for is match. Questions? Okay. And this is where if we have time, I might go back to this, but again, I'll send you these slides and these links. I think I included that in your email yesterday too. There's a great, MWCC does these monthly conservation conversations that if you haven't, some of them are pretty interesting and useful to your work. We did one back in 2022 about exactly this topic. And Christine Brissett, who works for Trout Unlimited, is just great at this. And she just talks about like all the things you would never even think of that are match. And she also, most important to you, you don't necessarily have to watch that whole thing. You can. But she has this match tracking worksheet that's really handy for thinking about different things that are match and also for tracking them. Tracking everything else, kind of talked about this already, looking at that reporting form and submittable, but use that in your funding MOU, your funding agreement, that scope of work at the bottom, that is your guide. You cut and paste everything from there. That is exactly what you're reporting on. Again, to Lauren's question, you can add things if they're relevant, but if it's not to do with non-point source pollution and not to do with tasks in your scope of work, don't worry about it. And then you also have that spreadsheet that is also in your MOU and your host sites. It's basically just your scope of work in a spreadsheet. It's not great. It's not I just haven't found or carved out the time to make a better spreadsheet, but you can use that spreadsheet that your host site supervisors have and isn't submittable, or you can just make something yourself. The biggest, if you take away nothing, if you remember absolutely nothing from this webinar, remember to track everything as you go. I mean, literally, I would just take that scope of work spreadsheet, put it in whatever format you want, and just start. It just can just be like, okay, I'm supposed to recruit whatever it was, 75. Lauren's supposed to recruit 75. I think that's exaggerating. She's supposed to recruit 15 new volunteers. Every time you recruit a new volunteer, just put a number in that spreadsheet. Just do it every day. Every day. It takes 5 minutes. Because if you don't, you're going to get to May 30th when your report is due and you're going to cry because you're going to not know what you're supposed to be reporting on. And luckily, I know you have to report on a lot of similar things to MCC or your monthly and quarterly reports. But because this is a separate grant and it only covers this work on water quality and non-point source pollution, you're going to have we just track things in different ways. And I apologize for that. It's not the greatest. I wish we could, but we've had this conversation. We just have never found a way because our grant is through DEQ and EPA, and MCC's grant is through AmeriCorps, and they just required it. So track this separately, but it's also a lot of it. I mean, all of it will apply to your MCC reporting too. I am briefly going to share a couple examples. These are reports from last year, and the reports are almost exactly the same from previous years. A couple tiny tweaks, but pretty much exactly the same. I'm just moving ahead in my notes here. So this is Allie Sutcliffe's report from the Gallatin River Task Force for last year. All the instructions at the top. But you can just see, like I was talking about, volunteer man. You'll see a lot of it was very similar. I mean, Lauren and Angelo and those of you who have Big Sky Watershed Corps predecessors, if it's the same submittable account, which it should be, you have an advantage because you can look back at those old reports, and a lot of times it's very similar. So you can take a look at what they wrote, and but again, there are links to these, and you'll be able to see them at least to look at these. But in some cases, like Lauren, it's like probably the exact same tasks. I don't know, but the first one is the same, right? So you're putting description of member activities. You can't see the instructions here, but again, Allie just cut and pasted. Here is my first activity under task 1, completed, and here's what I did. Task 2. These are their final reports. So your interim reports, a lot of things will not be complete yet, but completed. I recruited. And then this one, like you'll see, 180 overall volunteers engaged. Only 139 volunteers engaged. That's fine. She just explains why. Yeah, this is almost like, okay, you only picked up 150, but it's good to know, right? It's just standard, like, okay, we did a little less than we thought, but it's totally fine. The match, again, I am assuming she had this in a spreadsheet. I don't make you do a spreadsheet here, but you can see this is like really extensive. And you can see she ended up with, just in this one task, $15,000 worth. I mean, it's just like so above and beyond what you need, right? So if you're even tracking just a little bit, right? Volunteers help a lot, obviously, right? So 14 volunteers times 2 hours times 3180. That's a volunteer rate that I've got a link to in your FAQ document. The independent sector tracks the value of volunteer time each year, so it's a good standard. You can ask your partners and your coworkers at your host site what their actual billable rate is, because it'll often be higher. But if you don't want to go to all that trouble, this, like $31 an hour rate is probably going to get you there. And it's a good sort of, that's probably more than you would pay some people, but it's less than you would pay a lot of other people. So it balances out. Same thing with your staff time. Staff, you probably are going to know their billable rate, so you can do that, right? So Allie's, like coworkers helped her for 20 hours on this event, and that ends up being $728. Like, it's a lot of money. And then you get into the supplies too, like organizations donated trash bags, prizes, all of that stuff. Questions? And I'm curious if Megan has anything to add on this too. You don't have to, though, if you're not feeling it. Okay. And then I'm just going to scroll down to the last thing that's reporting. And I think it's probably easier to show you in submittable. So the one thing that the MWCC Watershed Fund does, because we're a nonprofit, that gets funding from federal, state agencies, private foundations all over the place. And then we redistributed that out to smaller groups. And a lot of the reason for that is that these bigger, like we're giving people like $5,000 to maybe $15,000 grants. Like for a lot of organizations, that is really, really tiny. And so it's a lot of groups just trust us like, oh, you know the local groups, you have a good review process. These are really tiny grants that we don't want to deal with. We'll let you deal with them and we'll pay you to deal with them. So I'm always reporting. So as much as you're reporting to me, I'm then reporting back to DEQ, and Megan is then reporting back to the EPA. And with MWCC being a nonprofit, we also just have to be constantly fundraising to be able to put not just these funds, but other watershed fund grants that we put out. So part of the way that we like show our impact is we say, with these funds, local watershed organizations have restored 100 miles of stream and lakeshore in the past year. They have implemented all these different conservation practices. They have engaged this many community partners. And that's how we show some of our impact. And so that's why we ask you these metrics questions. There's also a couple of questions, just what's worked well and what hasn't. But oops, I passed. Oh, is this the interim? Hang on. Yes, I'm in the interim report. That's the problem. Anyway, Lauren, so I've pasted a couple things into your report already. You're welcome, I guess. But if we go back to the forms in your final reporting form, and so it's worth noting, this is only in your final. We don't ask you to report it both times, but you need to, like everything, track it all the way along. So in addition to your deliverables for each specific task, oh, come on, here we go. Okay, watershed fund metrics. So MWCC metrics for demonstrating impacts of the watershed fund are these 4 things. And especially for these grants, some of them will be 0. Like you will engage a lot of community partners. I guarantee this first one, you will have a lot of people in this. You're going to work with volunteers. You're going to table at events. You're going to recruit people to plant trees. You're going to do volunteer water quality monitoring. You're going to do all sorts of things where you end up talking to people. Volunteer, or I should say community partner engagement, is not how many people liked your social media post. It's not how many people you distribute your newsletter to. It has to be something active. Like you had a conversation with somebody came to an event that you organized where someone's actually engaged, right? And that's all explained in here too, but just to point that out. Conservation, you might not make any acres more resilient, or unless you're actually doing on the ground restoration, you might have 0s for these. But everybody is going to have community partners engaged, and everybody is going to have conservation practices implemented. And as it says here, just direct impacts of your work, because there's always an argument to be made of like, well, I educated all these people. That makes our entire watershed more resilient. That's 500,000 acre. Like that's not what we're looking for. It's a little more direct than that. Because we don't want to, we want to be realistic. It's fine if you have 0s. It's fine if you have 0.01 miles of stream and lakeshore improved. That is totally fine. We just want to know for real what you accomplished. Community partners, here are all the types of community partners. One thing to note is other Big Sky Watershed Corps members we don't consider them community partners because except in rare cases, they're not from that community. So you can count them for your match tracking. If they're helping you and they're volunteering, count that time as in-kind match, but they're not going to count for here. This is like anybody who works within your local community. And then you're going to have the total number of engaged. And again, there's instructions all along here. These conservation practices implemented, most of them are sort of more like tangible on the ground thing, livestock infrastructure improvement, in-channel habitat improvements, road decommissioning. But the one that you will all have, whether or not you're doing direct restoration through this grant, is this watershed resource education. I don't think I've met a Big Sky Watershed Corps member who didn't do some level of this. So you'll for sure have this one. And then quite possibly others too. And then again, the total number of those, there's an explanation of what that means, because maybe you helped people establish 5 pollinator gardens. Well, that's 5 separate pollinator habitat things. Again, that's pretty well explained in here. Acres made more resilient, again, a little more on the ground stuff, but if you have done on the ground things, about how many acres has that impacted? And then that stream and lakeshore miles improved. And then there are some concluding questions that are just things to think about, like how has this grant helped you? It helps us look at, okay, what are the benefits to Big Sky Watershed Corps members and their host sites of this funding? Questions? Jess, anything you wanted to point out that I've missed or that was confusing maybe to other people?
No, I think you nailed it. I feel like every year you have like more to add, which is awesome.
Yeah, better or for worse.
But really, like you've said it and I'll repeat it, like tracking is going to be your number one thing that you do, and it's just going to make your life so much easier at the end. If you're not tracking properly, you're going to spend a lot of time just going back doing math and it's going to suck. So track.
Yeah, and the nice thing about these is we do also have and you may manage other like more project oriented grants. This grant is actually really easy in terms of tracking funding and stuff, because you don't have to show me any receipts. You don't, because it's really just paying for you being there. So even with your match tracking, you just have to say like, here's what we spent, but you're not having to get, like with a lot of grants, you have to save all your receipts. There's just a lot involved. So I'm not going to go into NIAs, but again, you all have a copy of that now in this slide. And I think in the email, NIA had a really good report too. I think it was just very similar, like, clear, short and sweet, don't spend, I just need to know the basics, don't need a novel. Yeah, there you go. Oh, I didn't realize we were there already, Jess. Words of wisdom. Anything you wish you'd known? Any of these questions?
Time to shine. Not to like beat a dead horse here, but the tracking, and just make sure you talk to your supervisor, because they're going to have some systems in place already with how we track. And so you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, just track. But also on the flip side of that, because I remember this happening to me, make sure that the way that your host site is tracking is going to align with this grant. An example of what happened to me was we have a way for how we track volunteers. And when I was doing my reporting, I realized that was everyone's volunteer hours, not just the ones that I was recruiting, not just the ones for non-point source pollution. It was our board members and the committee members. And so I had to go in and like do all the math to figure out which events I did specifically. So if it's going to make it your life easier just to have something separate, do it. But just know what systems are already in place. And it's confusing, but your supervisor will help you. And I think in all, maybe except for one case, your supervisor wrote this grant, so they already know what you're going to be tracking. But really, it's going to make your life so much easier if you just know how you're tracking and what you're putting it towards, especially because I know with MWCC, you're doing your tracking for them anyways. You're going to be taking care of a lot of it regardless.
Yeah.
How did this grant help me with my current job? Aside from helping me now then apply for it so that I can have Lauren on my team. It is a really great introduction to grants. It was, I think, like all of you, my first experience working on a grant, and it's a nice little introductory to it. So how do you report? How do you work with grant managers? And even if you aren't moving on to a sector where this is common, like I stayed with my host site, so I'm still writing grants as a part of my current job. Even if you aren't doing that specifically, I can't think of any position that you're not going to be having to do some sort of reporting or tracking. So even if you're not in the grant sector specifically, it's going to help you just keep yourself organized and how to keep track of all the great, amazing work that you're doing this year and beyond.
And I'll add something just real quick while you're thinking about the last one. I didn't think of this last time, but also like your resume going forward, you can say, I recruited 150 volunteers. You can say these things in your resume and in, applying for future jobs. So go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. Keep track of all of it so you can brag as well. It's going to go a long way. The most valuable thing, I feel like this grant, aside from all the tracking and the grant writing, I feel like this opportunity really helps me figure out my project management style and how I keep myself organized and how I work with my other team members on things that like I need them to help me with on any projects on this grant. And I know that's something that's going to be like developing throughout your entire career, your project management style and your working style. But I feel like this really gave me like my first look at like a desk job, because I had been coming from like really active, just kind of like monkey see, monkey do jobs. I'd never really been in charge of something before. And so it was really cool to just see how my brain functions in that kind of way. And I hope that you all get a similar kind of experience and just learning about how you work.
And that's such a great point, Jess, because I feel like I don't know where you all fall on this spectrum continuum of what you are doing and what you thought you would be doing. And you don't even hardly know what you're doing yet, because I know it's still all pretty new. But you know, we get a lot of Big Sky Watershed Corps members, just like a lot of us who, I mean, I started out in field work doing stream and wetland monitoring and trail work. And most of us come from that background. We're like, I just want to be outside all the time. But you really can't do much outside in January, February, March in Montana. And so some of you, I think most members have this experience where like, what is all this office work? But the reality is like the office work is how you get to kind of like control your own work a little bit. It's how you get to plan things and say, oh, say to your host, you know, and it might not happen, but like, hey, I saw this grant, like I'm working on this educational thing. And I just saw this grant through the Montana Association of Conservation Districts for education and outreach. Can I apply for that? It's how you like, you can have more, I'm struggling with the word, but just more control. No, not control. Initiative over like planning your own work, and not just somebody telling you, okay, go out there and take these water samples. Yeah, it's the way you really have agency. That's what I'm looking for, is like agency, like managing projects and actually coordinating things. And yeah. So general questions. I can always talk a little bit more about confusing things. I can always talk, we can go through that FAQ document if you want, or just general questions. There's probably just so much you're like, I don't even know what to ask about. I will just very briefly, yes, I did pull that up. Great job, Terry. This is that FAQ document that I sent you all in the email yesterday. And I'll double check. Like I said, I'll send you the slide. I think the slides and the recording are the two things that you don't have yet. I think you have everything else. But this FAQ document, if you're a Word person, and right, and that's another thing I want to emphasize with this grant is not everybody is great at writing. Not everybody is great at spreadsheets. I struggle. I've gotten much better at spreadsheets, but they are not my forte. And so we get that. You do not have to have perfect grammar in these grant reports. You do not, like, I just need to know what happened. And so if you are not a Word person, maybe this recording will help. Maybe that other recording on Match that I shared will help. But this is a lot of words. And if you're ever in doubt of just a general question, all the things about Match are in here. General questions, just go to this document. Most of your first stop is always going to be your host site supervisor if it's about the work in general, because they're probably going to know about the work. But if it's on the reporting or how to specifically do something, it is probably in this document. If it's not, let me know and I can add it for next year. But again, those links to the match tracking. How much non-federal match do I need from this? What if I don't have any match for one of my tests? Do I need to submit it? Like, everything is in here. And so really this should answer most of your questions. And it's even got, I didn't mention this earlier. I mentioned vaguely that there's this estimated volunteer hours. It's interesting. Actually, Allie had a higher rate. Oh, I think she was using the federal. I think that's what it was. Anyway, this is the Montana. It's okay either way, but this is the volunteer hour rate in Montana. I think Allie used the federal rate, which was a little higher. But you can just use this for all your tracking, and you can even click on the link and see how they calculate that. It also has all these other grants that you cannot use for match. General questions, just a lot of things. And I I am not screen sharing. I'm sorry. Anyway, I just gave you an overview of that FAQ without you having to look at all those, but all those things are in that document. And I'm just trying to think if there was anything else I really wanted to mention. And I think that about covers it, other than just call me anytime. I am here to help you out. That is what I'm here for. I will also be at your education and outreach training next month, almost this month now. There's a grant, you'll have a grant funders panel. So usually there's 4 of us who are funders who manage these grants that you can apply to. So we'll talk more there. And I guess just a little quick preview, since you all if any of you, your host sites may or may not have mentioned this to you, they may or may not have plans on this, but the MWCC Watershed Fund does also have small grants for actual projects, riparian restoration projects. Again, anything that has to do with non-point source pollution and reducing and preventing it. We will have those grants available, and those grants are only available to Big Sky Watershed Corps members. We often have members who don't have this funding who still apply to them. So it's not like it's only the 5 of you who will be applying, but it's really, they're only open to Big Sky Watershed Corps members. And so if your host site has a project in mind, you can apply for funding to that. And this tracking will help you with that. That tracking is a little more complicated because you got to put together a budget and a few other things, but there's a lot of similarities between them. And that funding, we're going to release the RFP, the request for proposals. You'll learn all these acronyms eventually. I'm aiming for the week before, like probably the Friday before that education outreach training, but it will be before that training, so that if you're interested in applying to that, I'll be there to answer questions. And don't forget the professional development funding that's already live if you're going to any events having to do with this work. That's it. Questions? Parting thoughts?
So when is this reporting form due? Did you say May 30th?
Yeah, the interim, which is also in the FAQ document somewhere, but yeah, May 30th for the interim and November 7th for the final. Okay.
Thank you, Terry.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And I'm looking forward to, this is like one of my favorite parts of the job, where I just get to know you all, because we'll be, working together to an extent on all of these things. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to hearing what you all get up to. And I hope that this makes you a little more excited about the office work, and also excited to get out into the field when the weather gets warmer. So, all right. And thanks to Jess and Megan for being here as support too.
Thank you.
Good job. Thanks, Terry. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.